How the world's longest underwater tunnel was built. Flanked by two powerful European nations, the English Channel has long been one of the world's most important maritime passages, and for most of its history, the channel's rocky shores and stormy weather made crossing a dangerous prospect. Engineers of early 1800s proposed a numerous plan for spanning the 33 kilometers gap. Their design including artificial islands linked by bridges, submerged tubes suspended from floating platform, and underwater passes more than twice the length of any existing tunnel. By the end of the century, this last proposal has captured European imagination. The invention of tunnel boring machine and discovery of the stable layer of the chalk marl below the seabed made this fantastic tunnel more feasible. But the project's most urgent obstacle was one no engineer could solve. At the time, women felt that crisp isolation as a strictest advantage, and fears about French invention shut down plans for the tunnel. The rise of area warfare rendered this theory obsolete, but new economic concerns arose to replace them. Finally, 100 years after the initial excavation, the two countries reached agreements the tunnel would proceed with provide funding. In 1985, a group of French and British companies invested moderate equivalent of £40 billion, making the tunnel the most expensive infrastructure project to date. The design called the Three Express Tunnels, one for trains to France, one for trains to England, one surf tunnel between them, alongside crossover chambers, emergency passages, and air ducts. This mounted to over 200 kilometers of tunnels. In 1980s, workers began expedition from both sides, planning to meet the middle. Early survey of the French coast revealed the site was full of fault lines. These small cracks, the lock water seeped to the log, so engineers had to develop waterproof boring machines. The British anticipated drier conditions and forged ahead with regular water. But only a month into the work, water flooded in through undistant fissure. To treat in this wet channel, the British have to use grout to seal the crack, create burst wake, and even work ahead of main burst to reinforce the track about to be drilled. With this obstacle behind them, both teams began drilling at full speed. Boring machine weighed up to 1,300 tons, drilling at nearly 3.5 meters per hour. As they dug, they installed lining to stabilize the tunnel behind them, making way for support wagons following each machine. Even at top speed, work had to proceed carefully. The truck layer followed the winding path between unstable rock and clay, punctured by over 100 boring holes made by previous surveyor. Furthermore, both teams had to constantly check their coordinates to ensure them were on track to meet within 2 centimeters of each other. To maintain this delicate trajectory, the boat employed the satellite positioning systems, as well as paleontologists who used excavated fossils to confirm they were at the right depth. During construction, the project employs over 13,000 people and cost the life of 10 workers. But after 2.5 years at tunnel, two sides finally made contact. British worker Grand Fred emerges on the French side, becoming the first human to cross the channel by land since the Ice Age. There was still work to be done, from installing a crossover chamber and pumping station to laying over 100 miles of track, cables, and sensors. But on May 6, 1994, the opening ceremony marked the tunnel's completion. Full public service began 16 months later, with trains for passengers and rail shuttle for cars and trucks. Today, the Channel Tunnel services over 20 million passengers a year, transporting light across the channel in just 35 minutes. Unfortunately, not everyone has a previous making this trip legally. Thousands of refugees have tried to enter Britain through the tunnel in sometimes failed attempts. These tragedies have transformed the tunnel's southern entrance into the ongoing site of conflict. Hopefully, this structural history served as a reminder that humanity at their best when breaking down barriers. One more. Flanked by two powerful European nations, the English Channel has long been one of the world's most important maritime passages, yet for most of its history, the channel's rocky shore and stormy weather made crossing a dangerous process. Engineers of early 18th century proposed numerous plans for spanning the 33-kilometer gaps. Their design including artificial islands linked by bridges, submerged tubes, suspended from floating platform, and underwater passings more than twice the length of any existing tunnel. By the end of the century, these last proportions have captured European imagination. The invention of tunnel boring machine and discovery of stabilizer chalk more below the seabed made this fantastic tunnel more feasible. But the project's most urgent obstacle was one no engineering could solve. At the time, Britons viewed their geographic isolation as a strict advantage, and fears about French invasion shut down plans for the tunnel. The rise of area warfare rendered this theory obsolete, but new economic concerns around to replace them. Finally, 100 years after the initial excavation, the two countries reached agreements. The tunnel will proceed with private funding. In 1985, a group of French and British companies invested a moderate equivalent of £14 million, making the tunnel the most expensive infrastructure project to date. The design called the three separate tunnels, one for train, one for trains to England, one service tunnel between them. Alongside cross-dock chambers, emergency passages, and air ducts, this amount is over 200 kilometers of tunnels. In 1988, workers began excavating from all sides, planning to meet the middle. Early survey of the French coast revealed the site was full of fault lines. These small cracks let water seep into the rock, so engineers have to develop waterproof boring machine. The British anticipated drier conditions and first attacked with regular bores. But only months into the work, water flooded in through undetected fissures. To drill in this vessel, the British had to use grout to see the crack created the burst wake, and even work ahead of Maybury to ready for the truck around to the drill. With this obstacle behind them, both teams began drilling at full speed. Boring machine weighed up to 1,300 tons, drilling at nearly 3.5 meters per hour. As they dug, they installed lining ring to stabilize the tunnel behind them, making way for support wagons following each machine. Even at top speed, work had to proceed carefully. The truck layer followed the winding path between unstable rock and clay, punctured by over 100 boring holes made by previous surveyors. Furthermore, both teams had to constantly check their coordinates to ensure they work on track to meet within 2 centimeters from each other. To maintain this delicate trajectory, the boater employs satellite positioning system, as well as spatial intelligence who use excavate fossils to confirm they were at the right depth. During construction, the project employed over 13,000 people and cost the life of 10 workers. But after 2.5 years of tunnel, the two sides finally made contact. British worker Gunnar Friend emerged on the French side, becoming the first human across the channel by land since the Ice Age. There was still work to be done, for installing crystal chamber and pumping station to laying over the hundreds of miles of track cables and sensors. But on May 6, 1994, an opening ceremony marked the tunnel's completion. Full public service began 16 months later, with trains for passengers and range for cars and trucks. Today, the Channel Tunnel serves over 20 million passengers a year, transporting right across the channel in just 35 minutes. Unfortunately, not everyone has the privilege to making this trip legally. Thousands of refugees have tried to enter Britain through the tunnel in sometimes fatal attempts. These tragedies have transformed the tunnel's southern entrance into the ongoing site of conflict. Hopefully, the structural history can serve as a reminder that humanity is their best when breaking down barriers.